Hi everyone. It works. 1, 2, yeah. So my name is Philippe Honigman. I'm an entrepreneur, and I'm going to talk today about ownership and ownership in the DAOs. So I'm especially interested about ownership because of, as an entrepreneur, you care about the power that you have on the ventures that you start, and also you care about the value that is going to be created out of those ventures. And I'm also a commoner, meaning that I care about how the value that we can create through the companies that we start are actually contributing to the wellness and the wealth of the society at large. And I found out after a few years that decentralization was a good way to go from closed companies to open ecosystem and to the commons. So that's why I also qualify myself as a decentralization hacker. So we're going to talk today about different dimensions of ownership. And the first one which comes to mind, obviously, is the ownership that we can exert through or on a company, which has two different dimensions. One is the dimension of power, and the other one is the dimension of extraction of value. And both are materialized through something that we call shares, right? As a share owner, you have actually part of some power of the power to direct the strategy of a company, and that's called voting rights. And you have also part of the value that is going to be produced by the company, and that's called dividend. Here they are. But then when we talk about decentralized network, DAOs, and decentralization at large, we have a different view where we care about the way power is concentrated. And actually decentralization or decentralized is kind of a negative definition, right? It says that essentially power is not centralized. It doesn't say how it is not centralized. So it's very open, and there can be many definitions or many approaches to define how something is decentralized. The starting point is that there is no central point of control. So again, a negative definition. But what does it mean for a DAO? So it can mean that the ownership is, the DAO is owned by many, right? Meaning that there is some sort of even distribution of power, of ownership across a large number of people, of parties. So you can think, of course, of a blockchain, for instance. Blockchains are often compared to DAOs, where the level of decentralization of your blockchain and the level of resilience of the blockchain is going to depend on the number of nodes, the number of miners, and maybe the distribution of the tokens themselves. But another way to look at DAOs is actually to think about some entities that are owned by no one. Not by many parties, but actually no one. And this is more like the A of DAOs, right? The autonomous part. Those two definitions are actually quite compatible. This is two ways to look at the same reality. In order to have a clearer view of what this means, I invite you to think about the DAOs that you have in mind and see how they can be either seen as owned by many or owned by themselves. So I'm going to go through a few examples. For instance, the Aragon network. I'm sorry for this is an old MacBook, so the definition is awful. But the idea is that the Aragon network in itself can be seen as a DAO, right? And there are many players, many parties, the Aragon foundations and the Dutch jurors and the DAOs themselves and the end holders or the token holders. So those parties balance themselves, right? The decentralization is obtained because there are different roles, different parties, and within each class of members, there are different levels of decentralization. For instance, jurors could be seen as some sort of decentralized group. That might not be the case of the Aragon Foundation itself. Another example is the plantoid. For those who know, this is a life form, an artificial life form. And it is self-owned in a way, in the sense that the plantoid owns assets in order to sustain its own life and reproduce itself. But in order to reproduce itself, it depends on other parties, which are artists that are going to create other generation, or the public, the patrons, that are going to fund the creation of a new generation of plantoids. So it's autonomous in a way, it's its own life, but it depends on other parties. Another example is the DAO, the famous DAO, which was designed as a decentralized investment vehicle for the Ethereum community. So it was decentralized, but actually it was not that decentralized in a way. And what is more interesting is that at some point, this so-called unstoppable application, so there is again the autonomous ID here, was in a way deactivated by the underlying infrastructure, Ethereum, through some action conducted by the Ethereum community itself. So the Ethereum community has never been seen as a part of the DAO. The members of the DAOs were either the contractors or the investors, but it was a party that was external but powerful enough to affect the course of action in the case of a crisis of the DAO. So this is super important because it means that actually the program rules that govern the functioning, the way the DAO works, can actually be suspended when there is a state of emergency, a state of exception that requires to do so. Another similar view can be applied to Bitcoin itself. Bitcoin has often been compared to a DAO or to a proto-DAO. There are indeed a number of parties in Bitcoin that coordinate through code only, right? The miners. And they create Bitcoins and they validate transactions thanks to code only. But at the same time, there is a number of actions that needs to be taken in order to evolve Bitcoin as a network. And that is done using interactions with other parties, such as developers, for instance. And sometimes there's no agreement between the different parties, and there's no code to actually resolve those tensions or those conflicts. So owned by many or owned by none, we think, and I think that it's a bit of both, and it should be seen as complementary layers. So the first one here is owned by many aspect. This is a network of multiple stakeholders. Some are represented in the code, some might not be so. And the other one is owned by none, and this is the open source crypto economics protocol that is indeed owned by none in the sense that it's open source, but also owned by none in the sense that it owns its own resource. So we call them the social layer, which is off-chain essentially, and the protocol layer, which is on-chain. So now if we look at them and try to compare them, the strength of the social layer, as I said earlier, is its evolutionary capability. It's the ability to actually face crisis, face state of emergency, and more generally, create a new direction in order to govern the evolution of the DAO. It has also the capability of creating legitimacy through the representation of all the members of an ecosystem. And the protocol layer, on the other hand, is often seen as rigid. We cannot change it. It's precisely unstoppable, like in the case of the DAO. And it can also be seen as technocratic. In a way, it's kind of paradoxical. But the open source code is opaque or difficult to interpret and understand by many people that are actually engaged in a DAO because they don't have the capability. And it's often a technical elite that is in charge of changing the protocol. On the other hand, the social layer is corruptible and is opaque. The negotiation that go, behind the scene are by definition difficult to understand and to learn about. On the other hand, at the protocol layer, the strength is probably the fact that it's immutable and transparent. So, on the basis of this view or this representation of the double dimension of DAOs, we have a short thesis here, which is, number one, DAOs are for ecosystem, not for firms. We think that we can span hundreds of DAOs on something like the Aragon network, but if there are actually firms, well, you can as well use firms, right? There's not a lot to be gained from DAOs that are actually not decentralized and not really autonomous neither. So we think that actually the power of DAOs is to create a new way to coordinate in loosely coupled networks, which are ecosystem, crypto networks, industries. So all environment where you have a large variety of stakeholders that do not engage in close relationship with one and another. The second point is that protocol layer and social layer are complementary. They are not opposed. We oppose frequently on-chain and off-chain governance, but we think that it's actually more like a complement. They are complementary to each other. The social layer is very good at adapting to change, whereas the protocol layer is better at implementing in a way that is trustable a process for routine and daily operation. And the last point is that those two layers should be as tightly integrated as we can, because they can profit and benefit to each other, meaning that the social layer can protect the autonomy of the protocol, and the protocol layer can protect the decentralization of the social layer. So as an example, I will end my presentation with how we do it, or how we plan to do it, should I say, in the context of the Tribute network. The first thing that we do, because the Tribute network that we're building is an ecosystem rather than a firm, we make a strict distinction between value owners and power owners. As I was saying at the beginning of this presentation, if you look at a share that materializes ownership, you have an overlap between ownership of value and ownership of power. You have shares and you can exert power and extract value. But in an ecosystem, it's very different. You have different parties. Some will want and will need to extract value out of it, and some will actually get something that is different, not an economic value, but an use value. So here, we have the distributing value of the system. We have three. So first of all, we have a security token called the TBX. And the security token is evenly distributed to three stakeholders. One are the builders, the people that create the network and that contribute work. The second one is, the second tier is are investors that contribute money in order to build the network. And the third one are the commons who contribute, well, the digital commons, right? So open source software, open knowledge, open data, open protocol, all the basic bricks that we need today in order to build our digital society. And we consider them as part of our ecosystem, and we should give back to this tier through the TBX, through our token. And another stakeholder is the users that create the liquidity for the TBX token. And this is my last slide. This is this time the distribution of power as opposed to the distribution of value. We created this structure while being inspired by something called collective interest cooperative. So the idea here is that we implement a decentralized power structure based on the fact that you have 5 types of stakeholders that hold each of 1/5 of the power. So there is no majority of the power in any specific type of stakeholders. So those are the investors, the core team of builders, the contributors in the builders, the users or organizations that use the service, and the Commons Council. And inside each group of stakeholders, you have the ability to vote in a democratic way. Well, that could be, if you have, for instance, a very large amount of contributors, it could be something else. It could be something like the holographic consensus, for instance. But the idea is that you have decentralized governance inside each group and decentralized governance at the level of the whole system. There is also something that is important, which is what I was saying by mentioning the DAO as a condition for resilience of the governance structure. The idea here is that voicing, expressing a vote, or having a decision power, having an influence as part of one of these groups depend on your actual activity within the network, and the trace of the activity that proves that you have one is actually the transfer of TBX, the transfer of tokens. So this is how the protocol layer enables the social layer that is represented here. And I'll finish here. Thank you.